Miss Thompson here again. We're now going to look at dividing fractions. But we're not going to use the model. We're going to look at the algorithm way. Our learning target today is I can divide fractions by whole numbers and fractions using a standard algorithm. And as you guys already know, an algorithm is just process. So we're going to be looking at the steps or the process for dividing fractions. So basically, guys, when you're dividing fractions, there are 4 steps to remember. First, you're going to leave the fraction the same. And as we work through examples, you'll see what I'm referring to. You're going to change your division sign to a multiplication sign. And then the third step is to flip the second fraction to its reciprocal. Underneath that, I've noted 2 important things about reciprocals. Reciprocal is just where you take your fraction and you flip the position of your numerator and your denominator. So let's just say that I'm taking the fraction 3/4, and its reciprocal will be 4/3 because I took the denominator, moved it up to the numerator spot, into the numerator, and put it in the denominator spot. So again, like 1/3. 1/3 reciprocal will be 3/1. I just vice versa switch those positions of the numerator and the denominator. One other important fact to remember when you're talking about reciprocal is that when you multiply reciprocals, they're always going to equal 1. Because again, 3/4, 4/3, multiply straight across, you're going to get 12/12, which is going to equal 1. Another side note to remember, Step 2 and Step 3 of the division process is really saying you're multiplying by the multiplicative inverse. So change the reciprocal and the multiplicative inverse is the exact same thing. And I will use those terms interchangeably as I go through the video. Last step, as with multiplication, is to simplify if needed. Again, because sometimes after you go through the process, then your answers may already be in simplest form, which means they share no factors, then you will not need to simplify your answers. But if your quotient ends up having factors that are in common for your numerator and denominator, you must simplify them out in order to put it in the simplest terms. So let's look at example 1 together, and we'll walk through division. So step 1 is I'm going to leave the first fraction the same. So in my first example, my first fraction is 3/4. So I'm going to write that again, leaving that the same. I'm not going to bother that. I'm going to stay as 3/4. Now, step 2 is I'm going to change my division sign into multiplication. So I'm going to do that. This time I'm going to use the X, but don't remember that a huge dot in the middle also means to multiply. Step 3 is to make your reciprocal of your second fraction. So since my fraction is 1/2, the reciprocal is going to end up being 2/1. Again, only thing I did was just switch the numerator and the denominator. And remember, when I changed the division sign to multiplication and I made the reciprocal, I'm really just multiplying that first fraction by the multiplicative inverse. So basically, guys, once I've did that, it becomes a multiplication problem. Just multiply your numerators across. 3 times 2 gives me 6. And then 4 times 1 gives me 4. Now, we just discussed this in the multiplication video as this is being an improper fraction. So I must simplify this in simplest terms. So I know I'm going to come here and divide it out. So I'm going to go 6 in there, 4 in here, goes 1, subtract that, that's 2. So my answer that I received after turning from improper to mixed is 1 2/4. But I'm not done with that because 2/4 still have common factors. Divide that by 2, and I get 1 1/2. So basically, once I do leave the first fraction the same, change my sign, make my reciprocal, it just becomes a multiplication problem. Now let's look at problem 2. Problem 2 has a whole number. Now, you can convert a whole number into a fraction by just putting a 1 underneath it. Remember, 1 will not change the value of your number. So I'm going to rewrite it, putting the 1 under it, turning it into a fraction. So, same steps apply. I'm going to keep my first fraction the same. So I'm going to keep that 4 over 1. I'm going to change my division sign to multiplication. And then I'm going to form the reciprocal, or I'm going to flip that second fraction to where my denominator now becomes my numerator, and the numerator now becomes my denominator. That becomes 8 over 3. Now from there, I'm going to multiply. Remember, now it becomes multiplication. 4 times 8 gives me 32. And then 1 times 3 gives me 3. Now again, that's an improper fraction, so I'm going to come to the side and turn it into a mixed number. 32 is up top, so that's my dividend. That goes inside the house. And then the 3 goes on the outside. It's just long division. 3 divided into 3 goes 1 time. 3 goes there. That's 0, 2. That goes 0 times. 2's left over. So my mixed number is 10. That whole number. That 2 is my numerator. Sorry, I coded over. And that 3 is my denominator. So it's 10 into thirds. So my answer to that particular problem is 10 into thirds. Now, let's look at it when we have a mixed number. Same exact philosophy from 2 through 4, or same exact steps in the algorithm. Keep first fraction the same. Change division sign to multiplication. And this time I used the dot so you guys can see that it was, that can also be used for multiplication. And then flip your second to the reciprocal. But before we can do any of that, as with multiplication, if you have any mixed numbers, you must turn those into improper fractions. So let's walk through this example together. So I have 2 1/4 divided by 1 1/2. So before I can do anything, I must first turn those into improper fractions. Backward C, multiply as, you remember. 2 times 4 gives me 8, plus 1 more gives me 9. Denominator stays the same. Over here, I'm going to go 1 1/2. Backward C, as I called it earlier. 2 times 1 gives me 2, plus 1 more gives me 3. And that's going to stay over 2. Now, I'm going to come up here and rework that so I have more room. So 9/4 divided by 3/2. So follow the same algorithm or the same steps as before. So 9/4 will stay 9/4. I'm not going to adjust that. Change my division sign to multiplication. I think I'm going to use a dot this time. And then take 3/2 and form its reciprocal, which would be 2/3. Now from there, it becomes a multiplication problem. Multiply your numerator, multiply your denominator. 9 times 2 gives me 18. And then 4 times 3 gives you 12. Again, I have an improper fraction, so I need to convert it into a mixed number. So 18 is my dividend, goes inside the house. The 12 will go here. It goes 1 time. That's 12. That's 6 left over. That 1 is my whole number. That 6 is my numerator. And then that 12 is my denominator. So the answer, when I divided first, was 1 6/12. But I've got to still simplify because 6 and 12 share a common factor. And I know that 6 will divide into both of them evenly. So that'll give me 1. And then 6 divided by 6 gives me 1. And then 12 divided by 6 gives me 2. So my final answer is 1 1/2. Now let's go through and work an example from each section to kind of review what we discussed in the video. So I'm going to do number 1 out of each section. So dividing fractions by a whole number. If you have a whole number, remember first turn into a fraction by adding a 1 underneath it. So I'm going to put a fraction bar and a 1. The problem now becomes 1/3 divided by 4 over 1. So basically, I'm going to take that first fraction and I'm going to multiply it by the multiplicative inverse, or I'm going to multiply it by the reciprocal of the second fraction. So first one's going to stay the same. That division sign now becomes a multiplication sign, and that 4 now becomes 1/4. Remember, once you do that, it becomes a multiplication with fraction problem. Multiply straight across, which means your numerators together and then your denominators together. 1 times 1 gives you 1, and then 3 times 4 gives you 12. Last step, simplify if needed. That doesn't need to be simplified because 1 and 12 share no common factor, and that is my final answer. Let's go to number 1 on the next section. So again, before I do anything, I'm going to write that whole number as a fraction. So I'm going to put a fraction bar and a 1. So out over here, I'm going to rewrite it. So it's 5/1 divided by 1/2. So I'm going to keep the first fraction the same, change the division sign to multiplication, form the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2/1. Now I'm going to multiply straight across. That gives me 10/1. Now, I just told you guys earlier that anytime you have 1 as a denominator, that means you're representing a whole number. So instead of putting 10/1, I'm just going to write my answer as the whole number 10. So my answer will be 10. The last problem, I'm now looking at fractions and a fraction. So I'm going to keep the first fraction the same. I'm not going to adjust that. So that's going to become 2/5. I'm going to multiply by the multiplicative inverse, or I'm going to multiply by the second reciprocal. So I'm going to change the division sign to multiplication. I'm going to use the dot again. And then my second fraction is 1/3, but its reciprocal is what I need, and that's 3/1. Now, once I've did that, it just becomes a multiplication problem. 2 times 3 gives me 6, and then 5 times 1 gives me 5. Step 4 is to simplify if needed. So once I simplify, I will turn that improper to a mix. So I'm going to go 6 on the inside, 5 on the outside, 1 time. That's 5, that's 1. That 1 is my whole number. That 1 is here, is my numerator. And that 5 is going to be my denominator. So my answer is 1 1/5. So to sum it up, the algorithm for dividing fractions is basically, guys, I'm multiplying the first fraction by the multiplicative inverse or the reciprocal. To break that down will be step 1 would be to leave your first fraction the same. You do not bother that or adjust that. Your second step will be to change your division sign into a multiplication sign. Your step 3 will be to find the reciprocal of your second fraction. And again, your reciprocal is just changing the position of your numerator and your denominator. Once you did that, it just becomes a straightforward multiplication problem. Multiply your numerator straight across and then multiply your denominator straight across. And then your last step will be to simplify if needed. Again, check to make sure that all fractions do not have a common factor. And then also check and make sure that you have converted all your all your improper fractions into mixed numbers. I am out of here. I hope this video helps. If you have any questions, remember you can always pause, rewind, or you may ask me or Mr. E. I will check you guys out later.